Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third session of Inclusive STEM and Tech for Good here at the Women's Forum Global Meeting. We will now discuss how to fight. Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this third session of Inclusive STEM and Tech for Good here at the Women's Forum Global Meeting. We will now discuss how to fight hate speech with love and how deploying AI can be an instrument pushing inclusion. It is a real plague and dangerous for the cohesion of a democratic society and the protection of human rights and the rule of law. Big tech platforms are struggling against the problem of online hate and abuse. A balance must be kept between fighting hate speech on the one hand side and safeguarding freedom of speech on the other side. How can we redesign trust and safety systems that directly counteract hate speech? How can diversity in design teams and processes increase the effectiveness of anti-hate solutions? We are extremely glad to hear how to tackle these topics from Sara Clemens, Chief Operating Officer of Twitch, Ruman Chowdhury, Director of Machine Learning Ethics at Twitter, and Kate Scott, Partner at Clifford. This session will be moderated by the brilliant Gina Neff. Gina Neff is the Executive Director of the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge, and Professor of Technology and Society at the University of Oxford. Author of many books, she focuses her research, among others, on the impact of the rapid expansion of our digital information environment on workers and workplaces. Gina advises international organizations, including UNESCO, the OECD, and also the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. Ladies and gentlemen, please continue to communicate about this session on your social media using the hashtags hashtag WFGM21 and also the hashtag Women for Inclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this session. I hand over to Gina Neff.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you and welcome, everyone. The question we have before us today really is one of central importance. It's how can we create more inclusive spaces in our online platforms? Now, this is a problem not just for the companies who host our social media platforms and others, but it's also a question that's facing governments at the moment, and it's an urgent problem for women, for citizens, for people who want to and need to participate in these online spaces for their everyday lives, their jobs, their work. So joining me today are three experts who really take very different kinds of perspectives on how we build safer and more inclusive communities. And they have very different perspectives on, and skills in how they bring to this problem. We know that augmented and automated hate campaigns exist. And in this panel, we really have an opportunity to think about the frontline stories and the experiences of people who are working to make the world online a better place. So let me turn first to Sara. Sara, you've worked quite hard at what you've called community health by design at Twitch. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in terms of making more inclusive platforms.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gina. So first up, yes, as you say, we have this concept that, design needs to be built into your service at a system level. And if you think about the last, 15 years, there's been this deep integration of personalization features, discovery features into every aspect of internet experiences. And what we really did was step back and say, how do we think about safety as a core component of the service and build ground up with safety as a core design principle? And so, this starts with our content and behavior policies, which define what is acceptable on the service. We then have our system level safety features. So that is both proactive detection, and then also our global operations team, which do review and enforcement of all our user reporting. We then step up to our creator level, and we really have thought a lot about how do you enlist the community in building a really safe online service. And so that is both our creators and giving them tools so that they can set their own boundaries with what they feel comfortable for at a channel level. It's giving their moderators tools to manage how the experience of viewers really manifests on their specific channels, and then enabling them to really set the boundaries around what they want to experience as part of being a creator on Twitch. And then finally, we have viewer level safety. So these are tools that the viewer can use to actually decide what is their experience of Twitch. So it's a multi-layered cake, and that's everything from building chat filters so that they can decide they don't want to see particular kinds of language, managing, proactively what their sort of both channel level and personal system level experience of Twitch is. And this is a perpetual area of investment for us. And we believe that in order to maintain relevance with our community, it's critical that we stay across how they expect to experience a service.
Thanks, Sara. Kate, maybe we can zoom out just a bit and look at how this is not just a problem being tackled by one particular company or many individual companies, but rather something that is a challenge for policy and regulation. Do you want to walk us through what some of the legal stakes are at play in terms of inclusive online platforms?
Of course, Gina, and thank you. And perhaps just to introduce myself. So I'm a litigation partner at Clifford, and so I spend a lot of my time helping clients really trying to avoid disputes, regulatory enforcement action. And so a real focus on mitigating technology-related risk. And what we do is really think about what might go wrong, looking at the issues both legally and reputationally, and spend quite a lot of time thinking about how to mitigate those risks. I think the interesting thing about online harm is it takes so many different forms. And I very much like Sara's reference to this being a multi-layered cake. I think that's equally true when you look at it from a legal perspective. First of all, at the top of your cake, you have the criminal law, and what role does that play? And certainly the UK government is looking at reform of the communications offences, recognising that the threshold for criminality in this space is perhaps set too low. Then you have the civil law, that may be by reference to individuals pursuing those who make, for example, defamatory comments or other forms of online hate. It may be using civil remedies to try and help remove that content online. And in that space, obviously, the online harms bill is a great step in the right direction. But I think all of those legal remedies have limits. They require individuals to know that they need to take steps, and actually individuals need to know what they need to do, how they might enforce those rights. And in many cases, that is difficult, particularly when those who are subject to this online harm are part of marginalised communities. And so that's really why I think this discussion is absolutely in the right place, because we should be talking about regulation of platforms. And actually, I think AI has a real role into making that policing more efficient, more effective, and that's really why it's so important. So I'm looking forward to developing that in our discussion today.
Thanks, Kate. And just to bring others into the conversation, the online harms bill, online safety bill is legislation that's being worked out in the UK Parliament at the moment. So it's an exciting time to be having this discussion in the UK. And it'll be interesting to see how we can bring global perspectives to that as well. Ruman, turning to you, you've talked about some of the limitations of individual actions and content moderation, for example, to thinking about creating these spaces. What would you add to these two angles that we've already explored?
Yeah, thank you, Gina. And as a bit of introduction, I suppose the angle I provide here is as a machine learning practitioner, as well as a social scientist. So I'm deeply interested in the intersection of the two and essentially how we can reconcile two fields that are quite difficult. One thing I think about quite deeply, not just in my role, but with complementary teams at Twitter, such as our conversational health team, is how can we create the right kinds of systems to identify and proactively limit these kinds of harms? And it's quite complex. A lot of these situations are very context specific. They may target certain kinds of individuals, and in some cases, the protections that exist today, and for example, I'm just going to use Twitter, the ability to block people, the ability to go into protected status or to close your DMs, are not necessarily tools that are available to everybody. So for example, women journalists, who are some of the most harassed women online, but also by nature of their profession, need to keep themselves open to be reached out to, open for conversation, and be more accessible. So they can't necessarily utilize some of these features. So these are kind of the problems that we think about, but also in reconciling some of the new legislation that we're seeing coming out. I'm seeing a lot more discussion about audits and assessments. And two concerns I have is, one, the nature of audit is not always clearly defined. And two, sometimes it is defined in a way where, as a company, we would have to collect and source sensitive information that maybe we don't do today. For example, Twitter does not collect demographic information. Some of these bills and laws almost paradoxically would require us to collect more invasive information about people than even we have today in order to address and mitigate these harms. And I'm, I would love to have a conversation about what that balance is and what that looks like.
That's great. Thank you. So that we can get a fuller picture of what is at stake, what might we be working toward? What are we fighting for? So paint us a picture of what inclusive online spaces looks like. Paint us a picture of what great communities online could be, and perhaps how we're falling short today. Sara, Ruman, Sara.
Sorry, I wasn't sure who that was directed towards. Our ambition is that we have global communities that represent the full range of society. And so if you take your woman, it's 51% of the global population. That constituency needs to be able to experience online services in a safe and inclusive fashion, as should everybody. And so we're really thinking about what is the experience of diverse communities, underrepresented minorities, and I think constituencies that have been underserved historically. And so it's what tools are you building? What policies are you establishing? What are the behavioral norms that you support and amplify to demonstrate that that is the bar that you expect on the people who come and are part of your community? So, at Twitch, we have 7 million daily streamers, 30 million viewers from all countries on the planet other than China. And it's an incredibly diverse range of behavioral norms. And so, to the point that Ruman raised, it's a very challenging issue of how do you do this? And for us, we're a live streaming service and 90% of our content is live. That adds a whole other challenge to it, in that the behaviors you do not want to see, you have to identify in real time and then actually remove as quickly as possible. The advantage with live is that it doesn't create much in the way of virality. You don't get a clip is taken and then distributed very rapidly across services. So there's some inherent protections that are built into the system. But for us, we've really spent our time thinking about, how do we ensure that every single person who wants to be part of the Twitch community or a Twitch community can do so in a safe and inclusive fashion.
I really appreciate your answer, Sara. I think it's quite similar. My answer would be quite similar. If you think about, what is the purpose of social media? What benefit does it bring? What it allows is people who generally cannot utilize traditional institutions of having their voices heard to have their voices heard, right? So social media platforms have helped surface movements like Black Lives Matter, for example, have raised awareness to police brutality in the United States, have raised awareness to violence against trans communities, especially in the UK. But paradoxically, these are also, in doing so, it also exposes these people to a lot more hate and attack. So what I think about as an inclusive community is one in which the individuals who can't take advantage of traditional institutions and infrastructures have a place to still have themselves heard. And it generally then would preference people who are on the fringes of society, who are maybe more marginalized and are certainly not the people that our usual institutions are built for. And to Sarah's point about, the global context, I think one of the most beautiful things is that everybody shows up as their authentic selves in a way that is respectful and that is interesting for other people. One of the most beautiful things to see on global social media platforms is how much cross-cultural knowledge is being shared, and everything when it comes from food to clothing preferences to even movies and music. It's hard for us to remember a time when it was really difficult to get a foreign language movie or hear a foreign language song. And now it is as easy as opening Spotify or opening Twitter or opening Twitch and seeing what people all around the world are doing. So in my mind, that would be a wonderfully inclusive community.
And so let's talk a little bit about the ways that we get to these ideals. We've talked a bit about how automating the challenges and the opportunities that automating approaches to online safety pose. So Sara, Kate, if you want to jump in on really what are some of the barriers we're having at the moment to achieving these goals?
Look, I mean, I was going to talk about AI because I think AI is actually a great way to try and tackle some of these problems, but it's not a full solution. And I think it needs to be recognized in that context. I'm very interested in hearing from Sara and Ruman about how their organizations approach this problem. But speaking as an observer and who's somebody who is working with various firms in implementing AI, I do think that actually you need to be pretty clear about what you're trying to do. So AI is only as good as the way in which it's programmed. So obviously it needs, for example, a data set to be able to identify the online harm, and then it needs to be programmed to identify what steps might be taken as a result. I think you need to be quite clear about whether you're using AI as a tool alone, or in fact, whether it might be a triage tool. So, and I know that various platforms use AI as a triage tool before human moderation of content, perhaps making sure that actually the worst and most egregious examples are tackled early. And to me, that seems to be a very sensible and smart way in which to use AI. And I think the difficulty is really around those use cases. So when I talk about AI not being a full solution, I think this problem is so difficult because it's very difficult for AI to deal with, edge cases. I'm going to give an example, a well-known one, but for example, whether breastfeeding content counts as nudity on an online platform. How do you train AI to test the context that's specific to effectively the poster or the speaker? Power dynamics, race relations, cultural norms, all of those things are extremely difficult to program, and others are best placed to speak about how you might do so. But I think that all feeds into is really the sort of trust element where you're looking at AI as a solution here. I think actually users of platforms are disappointed when they feel that AI is not that full solution. And actually, perhaps we need to be better at communicating some of the limitations, that actually this is a war against online abusive content. It's a constant battle, and it's all about kind of incremental steps. And I think explaining, and companies being transparent actually about how they use their AI, explaining it to their users, I actually think that can build the trust that actually this isn't perfect, but efforts are being made. And so I'm very interested in hearing from Sara and Ruman about, I'm speculating on how it's being approached, but is that mirrored in practice? Are those really some of the challenges?
Kate, I think you're highlighting something really, an interesting nuance here, right? So there is sort of this blanket narrative of, AI can amplify, or ML can amplify misinformation. But then there's also the secondary narrative of, but also our best tools to, at some level, identify misinformation and harm are ML systems. So I would say the first thing is sort of to distinguish the two. One is, systems that are built for other purposes, such as providing content or amplifying, whatever content folks are seeing, versus the ML that is built to identify harms. And I make that distinction because where they might falter is quite different. And to your larger point about, communicating that, these systems are not going to fix all the problems, I think that is probably the most critical narrative to be had. So if we put aside the ML's recommender systems can amplify misinformation or hate speech, and focus on the ML systems can also be utilized to identify and mitigate. An important way, I think, to frame this conversation is much like how we think about cybersecurity. It's, there are folks that are out there trying to protect you by building these systems, but they are exactly that, technological systems. These are not magical. They can't read your mind. They can't understand what everything is saying. And that there are individuals and groups out there actively dedicated to avoiding these systems. So again, much like cybersecurity, it can only be as good as the worst person in the world, if you can think about it that way. And then with that appreciation, how can we communicate to people, maybe in some part, the role they can play in helping assist? So maybe this can be reporting malicious content or bad information, or even something as simple as sort of thinking twice before retweeting something very clickbaity, or verifying what they're looking at. So, in that sense, if we frame it as this is a really tough problem to tackle, ML can't tackle all of it, it then becomes a collaborative discussion with people.
I just, amplifying what both Kate and Ruman said, but I think there is a nirvana of online services being able to use ML to remove all bad content before anybody sees it. And that's sort of this view that you get from people of like, well, why aren't you doing that? Why aren't you simply removing it? And I'll give you a concrete example of why this is challenging. We have gore and violence review from a machine learning perspective on Twitch. And so any content that is flagged as gore or violence is removed and then reviewed by human beings so that we can improve the machines over time. So, machines for quantity, humans for quality. We also have a material proportion of our content is people playing video games. And video games have lots of violence in them. And so these systems, because the resolution on video games is so good, they can't distinguish between real life violence and video game violence, or media or any other form of created content. And so there's a very, very high false positive rate, which we then work through in order to identify the content that actually needs to be removed. But I think to the point, machine learning systems are just structured data sets that are saying, is this thing A or B, and what should I do with it? They are not able to handle the nuance of this is a cartoon version of this versus this is a real life version of this. And once you get into behavioral things like harassment or hateful speech, misinformation, that nuance gets an incredibly broad continuum that you're operating in. And I think this is why it's so important to understand that human systems, where people are actually working with their communities to identify and report those behaviors that you want to remove are utterly critical and are going to be around for a very long time in order to create safe communities.
Ruman, you've talked about the difficulties and challenges of that work. Even the human content moderation isn't a panacea.
Yes, absolutely. So I do want to preface by saying that, my team focuses on ML ethics. We're not a conversational health team, but of course these things are very related. An example of the kind of work my team does and why it's related to your question, Gina, is, there can be biases in these systems. So there are experts that build, these toxic speech identifier systems, which start with, human moderation and human flagging. But then my team comes in and looks at, for example, the biases that can occur in these systems, and a couple of specific things I can talk about. One is a really fascinating paper by a team at Google that actually talked about human content moderation that ends up building the training data for these toxicity models, and how, so the way they're generally structured, and I'm happy to share the paper after our conversation. Generally how they're structured is there's a team of, let's say, 5 individuals who would vote on certain images to identify whether or not they are toxic. So to clarify, toxic speech or toxic images are things that do not violate terms of service. They're not very clearly violence or hate speech, but fall in that realm of like things that are offensive, things that do not contribute to a good conversation. So toxicity is a really interesting term to talk about, because it's constantly shifting, very context. All of the challenges we're raising here are generally about toxic content, right? So these are not things that are violating terms of service. So these, let's say, 5 individuals would all vote. Now, the paper from Google is actually about, what happens when you have dissenting voices. Who are these dissenting voices, and who do they tend to represent? Is there some sort of pattern to who is dissenting and what they're dissenting about? And what they find is that a majority vote is exactly that. It can prefer majority. And what also happens is these human content moderators who are doing these votings can even be penalized because they are flagging, let's say, marginalized or niche issues that others may not be aware of or subject to. I'll give you a very concrete example that that my team has been working on with our toxicity team. There are, of course, always false positives in these models. A false positive is an example of something that is flagged as toxic that is not toxic. And generally, we can find patterns in some things that are identified as toxic speech that are not. And of course, that would be an example of a bias that we would want to correct. One example that's pretty well documented is African American vernacular English and or like other forms of reclaimed speech. AAVE is often flagged as hate speech or toxic speech, even though it is incorrect. It is just a way of communication. Similarly, reclaimed speech is a really interesting one to me because it falls into a different category where it is not necessarily a single particular group that utilizes reclaimed speech. So what reclaimed speech is when a marginalized community reuses the very slurs that are used against them as a way of, empowering themselves. What is interesting about reclaimed speech to me is that it's actually a diffuse false positive. There is not a single group that does reclaimed speech. All marginalized groups use some sort of reclaimed speech. And that may be a reason why it is difficult to identify as a systemic harm, even though it is something that impacts literally all marginalized groups. So these are really fascinating, interesting examples of how these models can fall apart, but also how we can start addressing and identifying and fixing some of the harms that we're seeing in these models.
But this strikes me as really coming to the core of some of the thorny issues at play. And here's where I'd like to bring Kate back in, because, we have a situation where the harm is contextually dependent and not necessarily individually experienced. So when we talk in fora like the Women's Forum, we want to talk about inclusive spaces. We want spaces to be inclusive for groups. And to hear that your talk about toxic language of being of concern, language that doesn't rise to the level of violating terms of service, certainly not violating legal norms, but not creating healthy communities. That is about a social benefit or social harm, as it were. Kate, from a regulatory perspective, that must be an incredibly difficult position now for us to be thinking about in terms of various regulatory and legislative measures going forward, to think about, what does it mean to ask for safe online spaces? What does it mean for social harms versus individual harms? Doesn't that change how we think about what harm is in the legal context?
Look, I think that's a hugely sort of multifaceted comment, Gina. Apologies, slight cough, residual cough. And what I would say is that I do think that the law has a role to play in multiple different ways. So I think, as I talked about at the top of the call, it's absolutely right that the criminal law has a role here. And I think it is important that we look and see whether the criminal law is fit for purpose and assess that. That's something that's happening in the UK, but it's being mirrored globally. And it's all about, how do you identify those bad actors? Obviously, in doing that, firms, platforms really have to balance effectively those considerations against human rights. So things like your rights, your freedom of speech, your ability to make comments, your rights to privacy, and how the law as a policy matter brings all of those considerations together is something that one individual can take a very different view from another individual. What I think is that the focus needs to be on is, from my view, certain kind of minimum standards. So I do think that actually it is right, and I'm supportive of the online harms bill in the UK, because actually it starts to provide a framework, it starts to provide guidance to platforms, for example, about how to tackle some of these issues. Of course, platforms are already taking a number of steps in that regard, and in terms of their own policies and procedures, I am sure Ruben and Sara will tell me that lots and lots of consideration is given to the governance around handling online harms, the manner in which you do so. I mean, the example that Ruben has just given in terms of seeking minority views, in terms of moderating content, is critically important. The question is enough being done? And how does the law moderate that? And how does the law keep pace with this space where, in effect, technology is evolving and improving, and AI and machine learning, as we've talked about already, offer one way to tackle this. But how does that keep pace with the kind of evolution, the different ways in which online harm, online hate is being promulgated? I think the law has to be flexible. I think it has to be not too prescriptive. And I do think it is actually a collaborative effort. I think the law is one part of this. Platforms obviously have a role to play with their policies and processes and procedures. But I do think the other part that we mustn't overlook is actually the users of those platforms. Actually, I think we need to be better at understanding, making sure we understand the rules of the platform, making sure that we do our part in reporting hate content so that it can be fixed and remedied. And I think the other part is providing support to those who are the victims of online hate and harm, making sure that actually we are speaking up, saying that actually we think that we will not tolerate this content, whether doing that in a public way on a platform or via private messages. And I think it's only when we bring those three things together that actually we will get the right policy drivers, create the right environment.
I'd just like to add one thing. It's really noticeable in these conversations. There's sort of this minimum level of behavior, which is almost sort of the regulated level of behavior. And then, here's this sort of toxicity layer. At Twitch, we've had a very different approach to this, which we have assumed from the outset that there are a set of behavioral guidelines that we will apply to being a participant of the Twitch community. And if you want to join Twitch and be part of it, then you have to meet those guidelines. So we have zero tolerance policy for hateful conduct or hateful speech of any kind of sexual harassment. All protected characteristics are protected. And for us, that's been a really powerful way to build these healthier communities. And we've actually taken a step further and said, we will apply this not only to the behavior that we see on Twitch, but if we are made aware that you are behaving in a way that is hateful conduct or harassment on another service, we will take that into account, because we do not want somebody like that as part of our community. We launched that policy back in January. We were the first service to do so. There are a couple of others who are now fast following, but I think the more that services are able to work together to collaborate within the boundaries of data privacy, obviously, on policies like that, it's much like saying to your neighbors, like, I wouldn't want that, that behavior in my house. And so I think this is where more proactive sense of what is a community and how do we collectively align around the right behaviors can be very powerful.
So that, to me, sounds like we need a shift in corporate leadership at firms, that we need shifts in culture that accept that is the norm or the goal to aspire to. How do we move towards those? How do we move the culture away from some of the scandalous conversations, boardroom conversations that have made the headlines from platforms who are not represented in today's conversation? How do we move tech culture away from that and towards something that looks much more proactive and pro-user, pro-person?
I love that. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And in part, it's because of my background as a data scientist. The data science community is actually built on information and education being free and freely accessible to everybody. Data science community is built on cultural norms. I don't think it is impossible to introduce cultural norms of kindness, inclusion, and acceptance into a community that is so driven by collaboration with others. I think it is actually part and parcel of it. It doesn't happen by itself, but I do think it is possible. So within our purview, within a company, one of the most important things would be to introduce education. So at Twitter, I've only been here since March, but we have a company-wide education on responsible ML, and we will also be following up with very specific targeted training. So to differentiate, education is kind of the 30,000-foot view. Why should you care? Why is this important? Why is this related to what you do? So it's to bring people on board. And after that, our trainings are very specifically around tools, products, methodologies, ways of thinking, ways of acting that would align with that education, so to empower people to be able to take action. It's a small step, but a critical one, because these people are not just employees of a company. They also utilize the platform. And to Sarah's point, they utilize many platforms. Employees of Twitter are on Twitter, and they're probably also live streaming on Twitch. So, any impact that we have in our house, to use your analogy, Sarah, right, is not just, confined to our house. It is actually portrayed in the behaviors that they will have in other places. So I think we have a very powerful tool we can utilize.
One thing I was going to just add to that is this issue of sort of culture, and how do you instill that culture throughout an organization? We're often asked about this in a multitude of different contexts, but I do think in this space, actually, the tone has to come from the top. So I think it's absolutely right that there is focus on this issue. I think boards of platforms obviously are paying attention to these issues. And I think some of the recent whistleblowing examples show how important it is to listen to your employees. And if they are saying that actually changes should be made, or we could do things in a different way, it is hugely important within an organization that there is a space to do that and a space to be heard. Now, I recognize that lots of these issues are extremely difficult to grapple with, and there's not one solution, and there may be differences of view as to what the correct approach is. Sometimes you have to strike a middle path. But I do think that actually it's important that you have that sort of top-down culture and the bottom-up listening where there are issues. And we can certainly see from some recent high-profile examples that that hasn't been working as well as it might have done in certain organisations, and learn from that.
In the 30 seconds or so we have left, what would you say to the listeners and watchers today on this call? What do we say to the women and men of the Women's Forum? What can they do about this problem?
I come back to the fact that, we are such a meaningful part of the global community. If we use services that have these safety by design philosophies that are seeing trust and safety as a core part of what they need to provide to their communities, then other services will follow. Ultimately, we need to demand that that is what we expect from the places that we spend our time online. And then I think in some respects, the market will deliver that. And certainly, we grew 200% year on year last year. And I think it gives you an example of when you provide that level of comfort, then the community will embrace you.
I would endorse that. I mean, I think what we need to all be is kind of good online citizens. So I think that has two parts. One, it means that actually, if you see this content online, it's not enough just to turn a blind eye to think that somebody else will clean this up. You actually have to engage. And part of engaging, I believe, means understanding the kind of rules of the platform, understanding how you might report content, as I say, being a supportive voice. And I think in this world, you wouldn't, if you saw someone being harmed in the street, all of us would intervene. We should apply that in our online world. It's not enough just to look away.
That is a powerful message to end on. I'm afraid we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I want to thank especially this incredible panel who have shared their insights with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.